In 1970, Melbourne's Westgate Bridge collapsed.
On October the 15th, 1970, one of the worst industrial accidents in Australian history occurred when, during the construction of the Westgate Bridge, a 2,000-ton box girder section collapsed. This enormous steel structure plunged 160 foot straight down onto the workers' huts below, killing 35 workmen and seriously injuring 18 more. In the late 1960s, construction had begun on the Westgate Bridge, a much-needed road connection which would link downtown Melbourne to the western suburbs and the industrial zones which lay on the other side of the Yarra River. Back then, the only means of crossing the river was by ferry, which severely limited the movement of goods and traffic between the two sides of the city. Melbourne was expanding rapidly, and as a showcase solution, the Westgate Bridge was going to be a symbol of the new, vibrant city.
I've been over this a couple of times, and this is something you see, and it sweeps around, doesn't it? It really is a real sight in Melbourne, isn't it? It's no harbour bridge, but it is an important bit of infrastructure for Melbourne, and clearly it has helped Melbourne grow. It's interesting how a lot of the times before the bridges are made, the road bridges, should I say, it seems to be ferries were the chosen method.
It was an ambitious project, with the envisaged bridge being twice the length of the famous Sydney Harbour Bridge, and it would also be one of the highest bridges in Australia.
It is long.
To get a clearer picture of how this disaster unfolded, it helps to have an understanding of how the bridge was being built, as the actual design and construction technique played a central role in what was to happen. The Westgate Bridge was to be a cable-stayed box girder design, meaning that giant concrete pillars would support huge prefabricated box steel girder sections, which would make up the central roadway part of the bridge, which spanned the actual river. In the centre of the bridge, two towers would provide extra strength and stability with massive steel cables supporting the longest central spans of the bridge. British firm Freeman Fox and Partners came up with the design for the steel box sections, whilst a different design firm, Munsell and Partners, was in charge of design and construction of the concrete sections of the bridge. In 1968, work started simultaneously on both riverbanks, with the local firm John Holland and Company getting on with building the concrete approach viaducts which would eventually bring traffic onto the bridge itself. However, the construction of the steel box girder sections was not going smoothly. The Dutch firm who were in charge of getting these done on time was hopelessly behind schedule, beset with union disputes and striking workers. By 1970, now a full 2 years into construction and costs rising, it was decided that the local firm who built the on-ramps, John Holland & Co., should take over the construction of the steel box sections as well. The problem was that their expertise was mainly in concrete, and they'd never attempted to build anything like what was now being asked of them.
Wow. So they're basically getting a company that has no expertise in doing a certain job to do that job. That seems like the first downfall straight away.
For the sections of the bridge which used the steel box girders, the method that had been agreed upon was to build each steel section at ground level, then use giant lifts to raise up the full-size sections onto the top of the concrete pillars. These sections were so large that they had to be made in two halves.
And heavy.
First, the left side would be made at ground level, raised up and placed on top of the pillars. Following this, the right half was made at ground level and then raised up. With both halves in place, they could then be bolted together along the entire length of the span, creating the width needed for the final 8-lane highway. The first span was quickly constructed and raised into position. Next came the second half. It was constructed at ground level and subsequently lifted up, and manoeuvred into position alongside its twin. However, it was immediately apparent that the two halves were not going to fit together. One section had significantly more camber than the other, which means in layman's terms that one half had more upward bend in it than the other. They should have been the same shape, but they weren't.
Yeah, that's sort of a given. They should be the same shape. What an absolute disaster straight away. To think how heavy these things are, how big these things are, to have that much of a difference, that is not going to work. I really hope they didn't then proceed with it.
In the centre, they were off vertically by about 5 inches. It's about 13 centimetres. To close this gap, it was decided to add some extra weight to the middle section of the half which was the highest. 8 large concrete blocks, which were handily already on site, were hoisted up and placed around the middle of the bent span. It was hoped that this extra 80 tons of weight would be enough to press down the centre of the span enough so that the two halves could be bolted together. The heavy blocks did indeed push the centre of the span down, but a large buckle appeared in the top steel flange, distorting the top of the span and weakening the steel around the centre. However, the two halves were now more or less in line, so workmen began the job of bolting them together, starting at each end and working inwards towards the middle. As they got close to the centre, the heavy concrete blocks were removed, but the centre section proved impossible to bolt together. The steel was so buckled and warped that this section was left unbolted while the engineers decided on the best way to iron out this final problem.
It's seeming like such a bodge job, isn't it? It almost feels like if I was doing DIY myself, but this is in a huge scale. When you're trying to wedge something together and it's not working, so you use a bit of elbow grease and it's forcing something. But with this, it's forcing something which causes a knock-on effect, then another knock-on effect. Not great.
It was clear that the compressed and warped steel around the buckle had nowhere to go, and the only way to flatten it would be to do the same as before on the eastern span, and that was to unbolt some of the central plating on the buckled half to get some room to slide the plates over each other and thus flatten out the warp. So the workmen started popping out some of the bolts, one by one. Sure enough, the plates began to shift, but they were now jamming the next bolts in place.
Yeah, on and on and on.
Compressed air hammers were used to smash these bolts out, but all the time the buckle was getting worse. The span was beginning to sag in the middle as more and more weight began to be shifted to just one half of the structure. Ominous creaks were heard as the steel groaned under the shifting weight. Nervous workmen headed for the lifts to get down to ground level. The head engineer on site, Jack Hinshaw, rang his boss, Gerrit Hardenberg, saying maybe it was time to get the men off site as the buckling continued to worsen. Hardenberg replied, "Wait there, I'll be right over." And as he got in his car and began to drive down to the ferry, he witnessed the unthinkable. The 2,000-ton steel span broke apart in the middle and collapsed. 10-year-old Udo Rockman happened to be on the opposite bank with his father, learning how to use his new camera. He caught the only known photograph of the actual collapse, taken just after the span hit the ground.
What an incredible shot that is. A pure coincidence of that young boy taking a picture. But it's just gone. It's just gone. And it's just a complete bodge job. When they found out something was wrong, they shouldn't have been trying to just wedge it in. No, they should have been restarting a piece, for example. Take the bit that was higher and more buckled, take it off and start again. That is safety. I would like to think that health and safety and all that sort of thing nowadays would stop something like this, but it's not necessarily the case. But that's really, really poor.
The impact was enormous. The wind blast from the falling structure flung people nearby meters through the air, shook buildings, broke windows, splattered houses and cars with mud for miles around. The sound was heard all across the city. A large crane situated on the top of the span was flung through the air like a toy, crashing down into the river. The workmen's huts situated under the bridge had been flattened to nothing, and one of the huge concrete pillars had also fallen over. It was a scene of complete devastation. To make matters worse, spilled diesel fuel had sprayed over the wreckage and now caught fire. Any trapped survivors had little time to escape before being consumed by the spreading flames. Emergency services rushed to the scene as uninjured workmen desperately toiled in the wreckage to free trapped and injured co-workers. Even after the fire was put out, freeing trapped workers caught in the twisted metal was an arduous task. The final death toll was 35, with a further 18 men seriously injured. Men died as they were crushed while they were eating their lunch in the huts below, or died as they leapt from the collapsing structure.
I've said this on the previous disaster videos on people are just going about their daily jobs and all of a sudden it's over.
One of the dead was Jack Hinshaw, the head engineer who had phoned to suggest clearing the men off the building site. Some of the bodies were not recovered until many days later. Such was the extent of the wreckage that needed to be cleared. There were also incredible stories of survival. Rigger Frank Piermarini was actually working inside the steel span when it broke in two. He described what happened. At first I felt it shaking, but I kept on working anyway. Then the whole damn thing sagged in the middle, and I could see daylight through the huge cracks in the steel. The noise was deafening. I tried to scramble out, but the whole world seemed to go into a massive slide. Everything went black, and when I came to, I was covered in oil, and there were bodies everywhere.
Wow.
The inquiry heard from 52 witnesses and came to the conclusion that almost all of the parties involved shared the blame to some degree. It was a definite blow to the reputation of Freeman Fox, the firm of British designers, who now had the unenviable title of having 2 bridge collapses to their name in 1970.
I need to know what the other one was now.
The other bridge that they'd been involved with was the Cledow Bridge in Milford Haven.
Well,
when that collapsed, 4 people were killed. Some of the twisted metal girders from the Westgate collapse stand in the gardens of Monash University's Clayton campus, a reminder to the engineering students there of the terrible consequences of bad design and poor engineering practices. The Westgate Bridge was eventually completed, and it opened in 1978, a full 10 years after construction began.
What a horrible story. It's negligence, isn't it? And it's bodge jobbing. You know, not doing the job properly. Yes, something went wrong with the 2 girders that were, well, not aligned, and they tried fixing it, but ripple effects caused more problems down the line. What a horrible story again. But it's great that the buckled pieces of steel are in Monash University, because like it's saying, it's this is what happens when you don't do your job properly, when it's poor design and poor execution. This is the devastation that can happen. And this is a job, you know, engineering and doing jobs like this, building bridges and infrastructure like this, and buildings. If you get something wrong, that is life-threatening to someone else. Not very nice. I said I've been over this bridge. It is a long bridge. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you found that interesting. Make sure you like and subscribe, and I'll catch you next time.